Let's begin with the inner world of a person who never feels good enough. This experience is not about occasional self-doubt or the natural nerves we feel when stepping into something new. It's something deeper, more persistent, and far more exhausting. It's the quiet, constant hum in the background of their mind that says, "Something is wrong with me. I'm not enough." This belief is not tied to a single failure or a single insecurity. It's woven into the way they see themselves. Psychologists often describe this as living with a kind of internal void. No matter what a person achieves, learns, or becomes, there's a sense of hollowness. Imagine pouring water into a cup with a hidden hole at the bottom. No matter how much you fill it, it never feels full. That's what the inner life of never enough feels like. The emptiness remains, no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary. One way to understand this is through what I call the moving goalpost. Here, how it works: you achieve something, a promotion, finishing a project, getting praise, but instead of feeling relief or satisfaction, the mind instantly shifts the target. It whispers, "That wasn't really a big deal. You should already be working on the next thing." What should be a finish line becomes a reset button. Rest is impossible because the goalpost never stays still. This is why I like to introduce the term chronic self-esteem deficiency. Unlike a bad day or a temporary loss of confidence, this is not a passing mood. It's more like a filter through which the person experiences their entire identity. Every interaction, every reflection, every plan for the future runs through this lens of insufficiency. And within this lens, the mind operates almost like a radar system. Instead of scanning for opportunities, it scans for evidence of flaws. A person might overlook 99 moments of competence, kindness, or resilience, but the single slip-up, the single awkward pause in conversation, or the single missed deadline lights up in red. Psychologists call this selective attention. Our brains can't take in everything, so they choose what to notice. For someone caught in never enough, the brain is tuned to notice only what confirms their inadequacy. This often creates a profound sense of being an imposter. Most people have heard of imposter syndrome in the workplace, but here it's broader. It shows up not only at the job, but in parenting, in friendships, in romantic relationships. The person may think, if people really saw me, they would know I don't deserve this role, this partner, this praise. And so they live in a quiet fear of exposure, as though the mask could slip at any time. It's important to note that this is not the same as everyday self-doubt. Everyone wonders sometimes, did I do enough, or could I have handled that better? What makes this experience different is its constancy. It's not an occasional visitor, it's the wallpaper of the mind, always present, always coloring how a person sees themselves. Over time, it corrodes the core sense of identity. Instead of "I sometimes fail," the belief becomes "I am a failure." When we try to understand why someone carries this lifelong feeling of never being enough, we have to look back specifically into childhood. These patterns rarely appear out of nowhere in adulthood. They're shaped in the early years, when a child is forming their sense of worth, security, and identity. One of the most common roots is what we can call conditional love. Imagine a child who only receives affection or praise when they achieve something: good grades, polite manners, athletic wins. On the surface, this can look like healthy encouragement, but the message that sinks in is subtle and dangerous. I am loved when I perform. I am not loved simply for existing. Over time, the child learns that their worth is transactional, not intrinsic. This connects directly to attachment theory, first introduced by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth. Attachment describes the emotional bond between a child and their caregiver, and it sets the blueprint for how that child will approach relationships and self-worth in the future. When a caregiver is consistently warm and responsive, the child develops what's called a secure attachment, a foundation of safety that says, "I am lovable as I am." But when the caregiver is inconsistent, critical, or emotionally distant, the child may develop anxious or avoidant attachment patterns. Both of these carry the message, "I am not enough to guarantee love and security." Now add to this the impact of critical parenting. If a parent constantly points out what could be better, higher grades, better manners, more effort, without balancing it with unconditional affirmation, the child internalizes that voice. Over time, this voice becomes the inner critic. Even when the parent is no longer present, the child, now an adult, carries that voice inside. It's like installing a piece of software that constantly scans for errors and keeps running for life. There's also the quieter wound of emotional neglect. Emotional neglect doesn't always mean abuse. It can happen in families that look perfectly fine from the outside. Maybe the parent was busy, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. When a child's feelings were dismissed with phrases like, "Don't be dramatic," or "Stop crying, it's not a big deal," the child receives the message, "My inner world doesn't matter." Over time, they stop trusting their feelings, and instead of developing inner confidence, they develop a belief in inner defectiveness. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on mindsets adds another piece to this puzzle. Children praised for their innate traits, "You're so smart," are more likely to develop a fixed mindset where failure feels catastrophic. If they fail, it's not just a mistake, it's proof they're no longer special. Contrast that with children praised for effort, "You worked hard on this," who are more likely to build resilience and embrace challenges. For the never enough adult, early fixed mindset praise can reinforce the terror of falling short, because falling short feels like losing their entire worth. And finally, we can't ignore the role of peers. Childhood rejection, bullying, or social exclusion cuts deeply at the most vulnerable stage of identity formation. A child who is mocked for how they look, speak, or behave often carries the scar into adulthood, interpreting future neutral situations as threats of exclusion. In their mind, they are still the child left out at recess, still the one who doesn't belong. So when we look at the adult who constantly doubts themselves, who can't rest after success, who feels like an imposter, we have to remember these aren't random quirks. They're learned survival strategies. As children, these beliefs and behaviors made sense. They were attempts to secure love, approval, or safety. But carried into adulthood, they become heavy burdens, keeping the person trapped in the endless cycle of not feeling good enough. Now that we've looked at the roots, let's turn to what happens inside the mind on a daily basis. The constant sense of not enough doesn't just live in feelings, it takes shape in thoughts, running like a background program that never turns off. One of the best ways to understand this is to personify what psychologists call the inner critic. Picture it as a harsh, internalized voice that never seems satisfied. No matter what you do, it finds a way to cut you down. You get a promotion, the critic says, they'll figure out you're not qualified. You help a friend, the critic whispers, you could have done more. The critic's tone is absolute, certain, and merciless. And because it feels like your own mind speaking, it can be very hard to question it. The inner critic communicates in the language of cognitive distortions. Aaron Beck, one of the founders of cognitive therapy, identified these distorted thought patterns as the engine behind depression and anxiety. For the person who never feels good enough, these distortions show up constantly. Take all-or-nothing thinking. This is when one mistake means total failure. A single awkward comment in a conversation becomes proof that you're socially inept. Missing one workout means you've completely fallen off. There's no middle ground. Or consider the mental filter. This is when the brain screens out all evidence of competence and focuses only on flaws. Imagine you give a presentation and receive 9 compliments and 1 mild critique. The critic throws away the 9 positives and magnifies the single negative until it fills your entire mental screen. Then there's overgeneralization. You bomb one job interview, and suddenly the thought is, I'll never be good at interviews. I'll never get a job. A specific event gets turned into a sweeping judgment about your whole life. Another common pattern is catastrophizing. A small setback, a typo in an email, a late response gets inflated into disaster. The mind runs ahead into a bleak future. They'll think I'm careless. I'll lose respect. This will ruin everything. What's minor in reality becomes unbearable in imagination. Add to this what psychologists call the spotlight effect. This is the belief that everyone around you is noticing, scrutinizing, and judging your every flaw. In reality, most people are too busy thinking about themselves to notice your stumble. But for someone who never feels enough, the spotlight feels blinding. Every misstep is imagined as public exposure. Social comparison makes all of this worse. With social media, we're constantly bombarded with highlight reels of other people's lives. This fuels what researchers call upward comparison, comparing yourself to someone who seems more successful, attractive, or fulfilled. For the inner critic, these comparisons are gold. They become proof that you're falling behind, that everyone else is thriving while you're not enough. What's important to notice here is that these thought patterns are not occasional. They are automatic and habitual. They run so quickly and so often that the person doesn't even realize their distortions. They feel like facts. And when thoughts that are distorted feel like reality, they create a self-perpetuating cycle. The critic generates negative interpretations, which reinforce feelings of inadequacy, which then fuel more negative interpretations. This is the machinery of the inner critic, relentless, systematic, and self-reinforcing. Left unchecked, it shapes how a person interprets their entire life. So far, we've been talking about beliefs and thought patterns, but it's important to see how these translate into real, everyday struggles. Living with the constant sense of never enough doesn't stay trapped inside the head. It leaks out into emotions, behaviors, relationships, and even the body. One of the first emotional consequences is chronic anxiety. Imagine living with the feeling that at any moment you could be exposed as inadequate. Every decision, every task, every conversation carries the weight of potential failure. This creates a baseline of tension, like an engine that never shuts off. Even moments that should feel relaxing, time with family, vacations, hobbies, are haunted by a low-grade hum of worry. What if I'm falling behind? What if I've missed something? Over time, this constant state of hyperalertness becomes exhausting, both mentally and physically. To cope with this anxiety, many people lean into perfectionism. On the outside, perfectionism might look like ambition or discipline, but on the inside, it's often a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to control outcomes so no one, including yourself, can find a flaw. The problem is, perfection is an impossible standard. You can polish endlessly, but the critic will always say, not quite good enough. This turns success into a trap rather than a source of confidence. Another common consequence is procrastination. Now, this often gets misunderstood. Procrastination is rarely laziness, it's fear. When the mind believes that only perfect performance will do, starting feels terrifying. Because what if you can't meet that impossible standard? So you delay, you distract yourself. You tell yourself you'll start tomorrow when you're ready. Procrastination becomes a way to temporarily escape the critic's judgment. But of course, the longer you wait, the louder the critic gets. This same pattern makes receiving compliments strangely uncomfortable. When someone says, "You did a great job," the inner critic quickly rejects it. They're just being polite. They don't know the real me. If they saw the mistakes, they wouldn't say that. So instead of letting praise land, the person deflects or minimizes it, reinforcing the cycle of inadequacy. Relationships are also deeply affected. Many people caught in the never enough mindset unconsciously sabotage intimacy. They push people away before they can get too close, fearing that closeness will lead to exposure. Others might cling tightly, overgiving or overperforming in relationships as if love must be constantly earned. In both cases, the underlying fear is the same. If they really knew me, they'd leave. Work and productivity often become another battleground. Some people become workaholics, throwing themselves into endless achievement as a way to silence the critic. External validation, praise, awards, accomplishments provides temporary relief. But because of the moving goalpost we talked about earlier, the relief never lasts. The moment one task is done, the critic demands the next. This cycle can lead to burnout, strained health, and a life that feels more like a treadmill than a journey. The heartbreaking part is that these consequences often reinforce the original belief. The anxiety, the perfectionism, the procrastination, the strained relationships, they all become evidence for the critic's case. See, you really aren't enough. It's a self-fulfilling cycle, and breaking out of it requires not just willpower, but a complete reframing of how worth is defined. So far, we've looked at childhood roots and the thought patterns of the inner critic. But to really understand why the feeling of never enough is so sticky, we need to step into the brain itself, because these patterns don't just live in stories or habits, they're wired into our biology. The first piece to understand is what psychologists call the negativity bias. From an evolutionary standpoint, our brains are designed to pay more attention to threats than to neutral or positive information. A caveman who ignored a rustling bush might end up as lunch for a predator. A caveman who overreacted lived to see another day. This survival wiring still operates in us, but instead of focusing on lions and snakes, it focuses on social and personal threats. What if I fail? What if I'm rejected? What if I'm exposed? For someone caught in never enough, the negativity bias is like a volume knob turned up too high. The brain pays extra attention to flaws and failures while filtering out strengths and successes. At the center of this system is the amygdala, the brain's alarm bell. The amygdala scans constantly for danger, and when it senses a threat, whether it's an angry face or a critical comment, it sounds the alarm. The body floods with stress hormones, the heart rate spikes, muscles tense, and attention narrows. For someone who lives with chronic self-criticism, the amygdala becomes hypersensitive. Even mild feedback or a tiny mistake can trigger a disproportionate stress response, as if the brain is shouting, "This is dangerous. This proves you're not enough." This ties into what's called the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system. This is the body's stress response pathway. In short bursts, it's helpful, it gets us moving, sharp, and alert. But when it's activated over and over by constant feelings of inadequacy, it becomes dysregulated. The stress hormones linger. Cortisol stays elevated. The body doesn't return to baseline. Over time, this can contribute to exhaustion, burnout, and even physical health issues like digestive problems, weakened immunity, and chronic fatigue. Another important piece is neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form and strengthen pathways based on repetition. Think of it like carving grooves in a dirt road. The more you drive down the same path, the deeper the grooves become. If someone has been rehearsing self-criticism since childhood, those neural pathways become automatic highways. This is why self-critical thoughts feel so natural and so believable. They're well-practiced brain habits, etched into the nervous system. Brain imaging studies back this up. Research has shown that people with high self-criticism show increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex and the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, regions involved in error detection and self-referential thought. In other words, their brains literally light up more in areas that monitor mistakes and evaluate the self harshly. And finally, we can't ignore the role of neurotransmitters. Chronic feelings of inadequacy are often linked to imbalances in serotonin and dopamine. Serotonin plays a key role in mood regulation and the sense of well-being, while dopamine drives motivation and reward. When achievements don't register as satisfying, because the goalpost keeps moving, dopamine release becomes blunted. Success doesn't stick in the brain's reward system, leaving the person always chasing but never arriving. So when we talk about someone who never feels good enough, we're not just talking about psychology, we're talking about biology. Their brain is wired through evolution, through childhood experiences, and through repetition to notice flaws, trigger alarms, and ingrain patterns of inadequacy. The good news, which we'll explore later, is that the same principle of neuroplasticity means the brain can change. But first, we have to understand just how deeply these patterns are rooted in the nervous system. Up to this point, we've explored the inner critic and the childhood roots of self-doubt. But to fully understand why so many people today struggle with never enough, we also have to look outward. Because our culture doesn't just quietly allow this insecurity, it actively amplifies it. Let's start with social media. Psychologists call it the compare and despair effect. Every time you scroll, you're exposed to carefully curated highlight reels. Friends post their best vacations, filtered selfies, and career milestones. Rarely do you see the messy kitchen, the lonely nights, or the failed attempts, yet the brain compares anyway. Research has shown that upward social comparison, measuring ourselves against people who seem better, is strongly correlated with reduced self-esteem and increased depression. In other words, even when we consciously know it's not the full story, our nervous system interprets those images as evidence that we're falling behind. Then there's hustle culture. This is the belief that your value is tied to how much you produce. Rest is treated like laziness, while overwork is glorified as dedication. We're told you have the same 24 hours as Beyoncé, as if human worth can be boiled down to productivity. The problem is this narrative leaves no room for being, only doing. And when you stop doing, even for a moment, the critic pounces. See, you're not enough. Closely connected to hustle culture is what psychologists call the arrival fallacy. This is the belief that once you achieve the next milestone, the job, the house, the relationship, you'll finally feel complete. Our culture reinforces this everywhere. Advertisements say, buy this product and you'll finally feel attractive. Career advice promises, climb this ladder and you'll finally feel successful. But time and again, people reach the goal only to feel the same emptiness, because the never enough mindset moves the finish line forward. Advertising in particular thrives on inadequacy. Marketers know that to sell a solution, they first need to create a problem. So we are constantly told, explicitly or implicitly, that we're too old, too fat, too inexperienced, too plain. The market feeds on the very sense of lack we've been talking about, offering quick fixes for a wound that runs much deeper. Cultural and family narratives also play a huge role. In some families, success is narrowly defined, becoming a doctor, earning a certain income, getting married by a certain age. Step outside those lines and shame is quick to follow. On a cultural level, we see similar pressures. You're expected to have not just a career, but the right career. Not just a relationship, but a picture-perfect one. Not just health, but an optimized lifestyle, complete with diet hacks, meditation apps, and perfectly toned bodies. Psychologists call this the tyranny of optimal living, the pressure to excel in every domain of life at once. And since perfection across all areas is impossible, most people are left with the sense of falling short. Here's the key insight. The feeling of inadequacy may start as a personal wound, but our culture pours fuel on that wound daily. It rewards overwork, it monetizes insecurity, and it normalizes impossible standards. So when someone feels like they're never enough, it's not just their inner critic speaking, it's an echo of a much louder cultural voice. Now that we've explored how this cycle of never enough develops and how it's reinforced, we need to draw an important line, the difference between striving and suffering. Because here's the thing, wanting to grow, improve, and reach for more is not the problem. In fact, striving is a natural part of being human. The problem is why we strive and how we relate to ourselves along the way. Let's start with healthy striving. Healthy striving is driven by curiosity, by values, by a genuine desire to learn and expand. It says, I want to write this book because I love expressing ideas, or I want to get stronger because I value health and vitality. In this mindset, progress is satisfying, setbacks are information, and rest is allowed. Failure isn't an identity crisis, it's just part of the process. Research in positive psychology shows that people who are motivated by intrinsic goals, like growth, mastery, or contribution, report higher well-being and resilience than those chasing external approval. Now let's contrast that with perfectionistic striving. This isn't about growth, it's about proving worth. The underlying belief is, I must achieve to deserve love or respect. In this mode, no amount of effort is ever enough because the critic always moves the goalpost. Mistakes aren't lessons, they're threats to identity. Rest feels unsafe because rest means not earning worth in that moment. Psychologist Paul Hewitt, who has studied perfectionism extensively, found that perfectionistic striving is strongly linked with depression, anxiety, and burnout, not because of ambition itself, but because the striving is fueled by shame. This is where the concept of self-acceptance comes in. Self-acceptance doesn't mean complacency. It doesn't mean saying, I'll never try to improve. Instead, it means acknowledging your current self as already worthy while still allowing space for growth. Think of it like tending a garden. You don't shame a seed for not being a tree yet. You water it, you nurture it, you give it sunlight, and growth happens naturally. The same principle applies to us. One practical shift is moving from product focus to process focus. In toxic striving, the entire emphasis is on the outcome, the grade, the title, the approval. But when you focus on process, the act itself holds meaning. You write not only for the finished book, but for the joy of shaping ideas. You paint not just for the gallery, but for the experience of creating. Process focus reduces the stranglehold of the inner critic, because worth isn't dangling in the future, it's present in the doing. Another crucial skill is tolerating imperfection. This means deliberately allowing yourself to make small mistakes and noticing that the world doesn't collapse. Maybe you send an email with a typo. Maybe you host a dinner where the food isn't perfect, and yet you survive. The sky doesn't fall. Over time, these experiences retrain the nervous system, proving that imperfection is not a catastrophe, but a normal part of being human. Finally, it's worth naming the difference between shame and guilt, a distinction that Brené Brown has powerfully highlighted. Guilt says, I did something wrong. That can be healthy, it motivates repair and growth. Shame, however, says, I am something wrong, and it's shame that sits at the heart of never enough. The shift from suffering to healthy striving begins when we separate our actions from our identity. Mistakes are things we do, not who we are. So the question to ask yourself is this: am I striving from a place of fear and shame, or from a place of curiosity and values? One leads to endless suffering. The other leads to growth that is sustainable, fulfilling, and deeply human. To understand why the feeling of never enough is so persistent, we have to go deeper than thoughts or habits. Underneath the inner critic and the perfectionism lies a deeper structure: core beliefs. Core beliefs are like the operating system of the mind. They are the unquestioned truths we carry about ourselves, formed early in life, and they quietly shape everything we see, feel, and do. A core belief is not the same as a passing thought. A thought is, I didn't do well on that project. A core belief is, I am incompetent. Thoughts come and go, but core beliefs sit beneath them, silently filtering reality. If the core belief is, I am unlovable, then even compliments may feel fake and even love may feel temporary. These beliefs aren't facts, but they feel like facts because they've been rehearsed for years. Psychologist Jeffrey Young developed a model called schema therapy, which identifies what he calls early maladaptive schemas. These are deep patterns of belief formed in childhood, especially when emotional needs weren't met. For people who live with never enough, several schemas tend to show up again and again. One is the defectiveness shame schema. This is the deep conviction that there is something fundamentally flawed about you. It doesn't matter how much you achieve or how many people value you. The belief is, if they really knew me, they would see how defective I am. This is the root of that imposter feeling we talked about earlier. Another is the unrelenting standards schema. This one says, I must meet impossibly high standards at all times or I am worthless. It creates constant pressure and self-criticism because the standards are designed to be unreachable. Even rest feels dangerous under this schema because rest means not performing. There's also the failure schema. This is the belief that you are doomed to fail or that your successes don't count. Even when you succeed, the schema reframes it. I just got lucky. It won't happen again. With this lens, every setback feels like confirmation of the inevitable. I'm not good enough. These schemas act like filters. Imagine putting on glasses with a red tint. No matter what you look at, the world looks red. Schemas work the same way. They color every experience. Compliments are dismissed, achievements are minimized, neutral feedback is twisted into criticism. This process is called cognitive confirmation bias. The brain notices and highlights anything that supports the schema, while ignoring or distorting evidence that contradicts it. And here's the frustrating part. These schemas don't just passively exist. They actively maintain themselves through what Jung called schema coping styles. For example, someone might overcompensate, becoming a perfectionist, a workaholic, or even aggressive to try to cover up the sense of defectiveness. Others might avoid, procrastinating, withdrawing socially, or numbing themselves to escape the pain of inadequacy. Still others might surrender, falling into relationships or jobs that confirm their unworthiness, almost reenacting the old wound again and again. This is why just think positive doesn't work. You can't overwrite a schema with a motivational quote. Schemas live deep in the psyche, in the emotional memory system, not just in the logical mind. They are old survival strategies, ways the child learned to make sense of their world, but what once helped them survive now keeps them stuck. Understanding schemas gives us a roadmap. It shows us that the voice of never enough is not reality, it's a learned pattern, and like any pattern, it can be unlearned. But first, it has to be brought into awareness. You can't heal a belief you don't know you're carrying. The good news is that the feeling of never enough is not a life sentence. The brain is not a fixed machine, it's plastic. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire and form new pathways, means that the circuits of self-criticism can weaken, and circuits of self-compassion and balance can grow stronger. Change is possible, but it requires deliberate practice, because the old patterns are well-rehearsed and automatic. One simple framework to begin this process is called catch, check, change. First, you learn to catch the thought as it arises. Instead of letting it slide under the radar, you pause and notice, I just had the thought that I'm going to fail. Second, you check it, asking whether it's distorted, exaggerated, or missing key evidence. Third, you change it into something more balanced, not unrealistically positive, but grounded. I may struggle with this task, but I've overcome challenges before, and mistakes don't erase my worth. Over time, this retrains the brain to look for balance rather than catastrophe. This is where metacognition comes in, the ability to notice your thoughts instead of fusing with them. When you can step back and say, I am having the thought that I'm worthless, you create distance between yourself and the thought. You stop being inside the storm and start watching the storm from the outside. This shift alone reduces the power of negative thoughts. Mindfulness practices strengthen this skill. By training attention to stay in the present moment, on the breath, on sensations, on the here and now, you reduce the grip of rumination about the past and catastrophizing about the future. Neuroscience studies have shown that consistent mindfulness practice reduces activity in the brain's default mode network, the system heavily involved in self-referential negative thinking. In other words, mindfulness literally quiets the inner critic. Another powerful tool is cognitive reframing. This is not about forcing positive thinking, but about balanced thinking. The inner critic works like a biased attorney, presenting only the evidence against you. Reframing is about becoming your own fair judge, actively looking for the evidence the critic ignores. If the thought is, I always fail, you might recall times when you succeeded, or times when failure wasn't catastrophic. Over time, this practice creates new mental grooves. Therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, developed by Stephen Hayes, add another layer. Instead of battling every thought, ACT teaches you to make space for them without letting them dictate your life. You might still hear the inner critic say, you're not good enough, but instead of wrestling with it, you acknowledge it, let it be there, and still take action toward your values. This shift turns the battle inward into a quieter, more spacious relationship with your mind. Even self-compassion practices, researched by Kristin Neff, show measurable effects on the brain. When you practice speaking to yourself the way you would to a close friend, acknowledging struggle without judgment, you activate neural networks associated with safety and care, rather than threat and attack. Over time, this rewiring reduces cortisol, boosts resilience, and makes it easier to handle setbacks without spiraling into shame. The key point here is that rewiring doesn't happen by accident. The old never enough pathways are automatic because they've been reinforced for years. Building new ones requires consistent, intentional practice, like strengthening a muscle. Each time you catch a thought, step back from it, reframe it, or practice self-compassion, you are literally training your brain toward a new default. And while it takes time, science is clear. The brain changes. With practice, the voice of inadequacy loses its authority, and a new voice, one rooted in balance, resilience, and kindness, can take its place.